So we're going to start up with Chapter 8 of Locke's second treatise of government, which is entitled Of the Beginning of Political Societies. And basically this is where we get into the social contract in Locke. Right away, Locke says, the only way whereby anyone divests himself of his natural liberty and puts on the bonds of civil society is by agreeing with other men to join and unite into a community for their comfortable, safe, and peaceable living a one amongst another, in a secure enjoyment of their properties, and a greater security against any that are not of it. So first of all, we have the acknowledgement that before we make this contract, we are in a state of natural liberty, which we've already discussed. It's, the notion that we are without a governing authority in the state of nature. We are each as individuals, the judge and jury in our own case. And then we see the idea of us as individuals agreeing with other individuals to join into this contract and create a community. So the community does not exist until we as individuals agree with each other to create it. So this runs counter to the idea of community as a natural thing that develops organically and somewhat unconsciously among human beings. Rather, it is a sort of utilitarian thing that is done as a contract, an agreement amongst us for the benefit of ourselves, for our individual self-interest. The goals of the agreement are stated: comfortable, safe, and peaceable living, one amongst another, and the secure enjoyment of our properties, the protection of those properties against those who are not a part of the social contract. So we already know that Locke thinks that we are not very secure if our lives are in jeopardy. So we can't put ourselves into a situation willingly where we forfeit our safety. So we can't involve ourselves in a social contract where we give up our agency to some higher power that then can do whatever it wants. We have to avoid that tyranny and create a government of our own collective will that will not trample upon the individual freedom and rights of the people in the contract. He then goes on to say, when any number of men have so consented to make one community or government, they are thereby presently incorporated and make one body politic, wherein the majority have the right to act and conclude the rest. So the important spot in that statement that we haven't already covered is the majority have a right to act and conclude for the rest. Locke quickly moves to the notion, very practical notion, that in any sort of social contract that doesn't involve ceding your rights to an absolute sovereign, where the power remains with the people, the only way of governing is to basically obey the majority will. So then, having stated what he thinks the social contract is, basically that it is every individual agreeing with every other individual to set up a government in which the majority ultimately rule, he then goes on to discuss two objections to his argument. The first objection basically is that where did you ever find a government set up along these lines? When did you ever see a group of people actually coming together and creating a government in this fashion? The second objection kind of follows from the first. Basically, it is that all people were born under a certain government, so what makes Locke think that they somehow consent or submit to a government? We don't see a historical representation of what Locke is talking about. So to the first objection, Locke basically answers that, it's no surprise that we don't have any record of people originally creating social contracts because they're lost in the mists of time, because people didn't, make any sort of record of these events. And I think the answer to the second objection has already been implied by Locke's treatment of the whole question of the legitimacy of government. he questions the traditional notion of government as given to you by some sort of divine authority, or, traditional authority that you can't question. He's basically asserting that it is natural that people do have the liberty to begin a new government and to dictate what that government will be like. Then he goes into an argument about, more or less, why it is that people think that monarchies are natural. So he's kind of covering some old territory, but basically he says, yeah, it's natural for people to think that the father should rule, and then that has some connection with monarchy. It's kind of paternalism, because originally the strongest and the most sufficient, self-sufficient, would come to dominate others and would basically be seen as having the experience and wisdom to suffice, and so would be followed. But he more or less implies that if this rule ever got to be too much and was tyrannical, the people would rebel. In other words, there is something within human nature which rejects abuse of authority. So the fact that people sometimes will settle for an authoritarian government, or one that can simply protect them from foreign invasion, does not mean that that government is ultimately legitimate. If you see that at certain times when people feel less threatened, they push back or even rebel against such governments, we see evidence that such governments aren't natural, but are still the creations of people's consent, and only for the time in which they serve their purposes. So that's why he says that as far as we have any light from history, we have reason to conclude that all peaceful beginnings of government have been laid in the consent of the people. I say peaceful, he writes, because I shall have occasion in another place to speak of conquest, which some esteem a way of beginning governments. So, of course, he does not esteem that a way. So, just kind of backing up and taking a larger view, we've just seen Locke's rationale for the social contract, that the social contract exists because individuals decided that it was better to live in the civil society than in the state of nature. It is a contract among individuals. Those who do not want to be a part of the contract can decide to leave and do something else. The contract, furthermore, is for self-interest, the self-interest of the individuals involved, primarily their self-preservation, which includes their property rights, because, as you know, Locke ties our ability to own and protect the property that we accumulate to our right to life, because any power that can take our property from us can also take our life. And also, of course, Locke propounds the idea of the right to be free to act as we wish to act and to speak as we like, even in the area of religion, unless, of course, we are atheists, Catholics, Muslims, or, atheists, Catholics, or Muslims. But we'll get to that later. So the social contract is to establish a way of protecting what is in our self-interest, to protect our right to life, property, and our liberties. Also, of note, the social contract is temporary. It is temporary by nature. If people have entered into it in order to protect these things, if they are not satisfied, just as if we are not satisfied in a commercial transaction these days, we can back up and we can break the contract. Same thing here. It's temporary in that if we become dissatisfied, because in our view, in the view of the majority, as it would be, the contract is not being upheld satisfactorily, we can revoke it. It's important now to take a step back and to think about what the social contract is not about, or what government is not about, according to Locke. Importantly, it's not about developing some larger community in the sense of some larger understanding amongst people of shared values or way of life. This is not about that. It's about individuals who decide that it's in their self-interest to join together for protection of very basic needs and interests. They don't come together and say, we all want to be communal, or we all want to be Christian, or we all want to be, some version of heritage or tradition. They are about self-interest. They're about the very basic building blocks of safety that you need in order to function and do business in the world. Leo Strauss famously compared the ancient perspective to the modern perspective. In other words, comparing philosophers like Plato and Aristotle to philosophers like Hobbes and Locke. And one of the biggest differences was on what government was for. In the ancient view, government was for the development of virtue, moral virtue, or character. The ancient perspective was that you were going to put out a type of person as a citizen who was going to reflect a vision of the good life, a vision of what the best type of life would be. Of course, the best life for the ancient philosophers was the life of wisdom, but lesser forms of government might emphasize the life of heroism or the warlike virtues, for instance. But at any rate, the ancient notion was that government was about fostering and developing a certain type of character in a person towards the societal definition of the good life. This is not what John Locke's social contract is about. Individuals get to decide what the good life is. They get to decide what they believe in the religious sense. They get to decide how they're going to live their life, whether it's by this moral code or that moral code. Locke does not prescribe that. So we need to understand that with Locke, or with Hobbes before him, there's this major shift in the understanding of government from an entity that actually tries to help and shape people's character towards ancient virtue or Christian virtue, either one, towards a type of government that stands aloof from that question, does not attempt to answer that question, does not claim to try to shape people in the direction of virtue or good character because it can't be defined, but instead attempts to regulate their behavior as far as, law-abidingness, as far as ability to be peaceable enough to promote, useful transactions amongst people. So kind of following along that, Locke's social contract is not about the hereafter, it's about the here and now. It doesn't proclaim that, we create a social contract so that everybody can be shaped in their souls to make it to heaven. It is not about that. It's about leaving that decision up to individuals, whether they want to do it or not, and if so, how they want to do it. But this is their own individual business. It is not the business of the government. If followed, the upside of this would be that governments would stop killing other people in order to make them into good Christians. But the downside is that the government becomes a kind of neutral umpire that doesn't serve as any sort of guide or rudder for the society. Moral rudder. There's no moral rudder. If you don't know that language, I mean by that there's no standard that the government more or less proclaims as to what is right and wrong. that is left up to the individual. And the cost of that is, or the price of that is, that each individual gets to have his own or her own point of view, and there is a great cacophony of points of view, and many people end up being confused. This is the cost of liberal democracy. Many people become very confused, and the regime, you might say, the greatest power in the society, gives them no direction. So, attempting to sum up the ancient view, in the ancient view, which is, I guess what you might say, the Platonic or the Aristotelian perspective, the regime shapes the person according to community goals and vision about creating a type of citizen. And so regimes vary according to the type of citizen that they put out. Do they aim to produce a spiritual or philosophic type? Do they aim to produce a warrior or heroic type? Or a self-interested entrepreneurial type? Or finally, do they aim to produce a democratic type, which follows the desires without a whole lot of guidance? Now, Plato and Aristotle pretty much agreed that the philosophic type was the best type of citizen for a government to aim to create, and that the heroic or warrior type was second best, that the oligarchic or entrepreneurial self-interested type was third best, and that the democratic type was fourth best, because in a democratic setting, in their experience, people tended to sort of run amok and wallow in their basic desires. There tend to be class politics and class warfare. Both of them, however, thought that democracy was superior to tyranny, which put out people who were either tyrannical in nature themselves or who were cowards. So Hobbes, before Locke and now Locke, rejects this ancient view of the role of government as shaping character, because they have observed that when people in power decide that they know what a good character is, it usually ends up in their experience, it ended up being a particular kind of Christian, and then people kill each other over a particular view of what the good life is and what the good character should be. And so they stepped way back from that and concluded that government should not be about the shaping of character, moral character or otherwise, but it should be instead about the regulating of behavior. And there are certain behaviors that are not conducive to peace and stability and prosperity. In other words, behaviors that are not conducive to good order. And that these are things that we all ought to be able to agree on as reasonable people. And so this is a much more firm foundation for government than the previous type, which had to do with virtue, and which set people down the path of fighting over, who was virtuous and who was not. So this is why in Chapter 9, Locke proclaims that the great end of government is the preservation of property. This could be seen, or would be seen, as a great contraction of the role of government from the ancient or the medieval Christian perspective. But for Locke, it is the end or goal that is actually achievable without as much risk of cataclysmic violence, where people argue about and fight over what the good life really is. So, if the great end of government is the preservation of property, Locke then states we need what is lacking in the state of nature. What is lacking is, first of all, an established, settled, and known law, so that everybody knows what the law is and to count on it and agree upon it. Secondly, a known and indifferent judge. In the state of nature, as you know, we're all judges in our own cases, but we can be very partial. We're partial to our own cases. What we need is some impartial judge, some third party. so that things don't get out of hand to where we have feuds because we've been truly unjust in our punishments. And third, we need a power to back the sentences of the judges. In other words, we need an executive power so that what they decide, what the judicial, whatever it is, power decides, actually is affected. Otherwise, the law is of no consequence. So, in chapter 9, Locke ends by saying that more or less the social contract must be one in which man gives up the power to do what he wants to preserve himself and the rest of mankind. He gives that power up to the government that's been created amongst the individuals who contracted. Whereas before he had the power to do it himself, but it was imperfect. Through creating a government, he gives up that power and puts it in the hands of a disinterested party. So secondly, man gives up the power of punishing violations of the law to that executive power, the governmental authority. In this way, he gets out of trying to adjudicate his own cases, you might say, and he also gets the consequent stability that comes from giving up this power. So you can see the social contract in Locke's perspective is very practical. It's about fulfilling the interests of every individual involved. And in that way, it is very mundane. It's very down to earth. It's not about things that people have a hard time agreeing about, in his view. It's about things that should be in the common sense of everybody, that they want to live, that they want to have the means it takes to actually survive. They want to have those things protected. They want to have their agreements enforced and so on. Also, it is very revocable, this social contract. It is made in the interests of people, and so, of course, if the interests are not protected, it is breakable. That's already implied here. He's going to go much further in later chapters about what conditions should be in place before people actually consider breaking the social contract. But even here, implicit in his description of the social contract is the idea that it is breakable, because it's all about self-interest. Now, while this sounds very reasonable and practical and scientific, we do need to be cognizant of what it erases. It erases a more traditional notion of obligation coming from a societal agreement, a tradition, a history, an identity surrounding a people who for a very long time have lived in a certain way and have come to expect that they will be treated in a certain way, and have come in fact to regulate themselves rather than being regulated solely from the top down. They regulate themselves according to cultural expectations and values. That is being replaced by the Lockean social contract with individual self-interest. So it's important to know what's missing here and what we give up. It sounds very good, but we do give up the notion of a historical people, its culture, its traditional understandings, its sort of arrangements that have lasted a long time because they are venerable, because they seem to work. As Edmund Burke would say in the wake of the French Revolution, the Enlightenment liberal ideas wrecked the notion of the social fabric and of tradition, and the idea that, as Confucius would say, the idea of family and community piety. So a big question for us as we evaluate Lockean liberalism has got to be, is it better than what came before it? Do the benefits outweigh the drawbacks? There are many benefits. Chief among the benefits is that we as individuals do not have to deal as much with a top-down imposition of some set of values or traditions that may not allow us to express and live our individual strengths and grow. This is a great good. We lose much of our cultural coherence. We lose a rudder. We lose a sense of certainty and direction and focus. We become fractionated. We become dislocated. And we are set adrift in a world where we have to define for ourselves as individuals how we will live our lives. That's a very uncomfortable position, and it's one that in the Western tradition people have been grappling with and struggling with ever since. Anyway, so next time we will move on to different forms of commonwealth as we move past the social contract idea into exactly what type of government the social contract should create. All right, see you next time. Bye.